The suite pretended not to be a hospital room. Money had hired carpenters to hide the fact of illness behind walnut panels and indirect light, to hush the antiseptic with sandalwood diffusers and a soundscape of distant surf. A bed disguised itself as a sleek island with brushed steel rails. Ventilators breathed behind louvers that matched the wood grain. A wall monitor glowed like an abstract painting if you didn't read the numbers. Machines still told the truth. They spoke in beeps and waves, in baselines and alarms that could not be veneered. They marked each minute with a small green insistence. Angela Beaumont pushed her cart across the threshold and became the idea of herself. Night shift did that for you. Faces blur. Names flatten into functions. A uniform tells everyone how much of you to see. The wheels clicked soft, well-oiled. Known, she tugged the microfiber cloth from the front slot, lifted a spray bottle, and made the air briefly lemon. Under the conditioned air, something else waited. She slowed near the foot of the bed. The billionaire under linen, a rumor made into a patient, lay still but not restful. Victor Blackwell's power had taken shapes before. Headlines, stock spikes, phrases like valuation and vision. Here it made a different shape. The hollow between his collarbones, the dry ash at his lips, his hair, expensive, even when unwashed, lay too thin against the pillow. His nails had a yellow that wasn't nicotine, wasn't jaundice exactly. The gums showed a shadow, not color. Tone. Angela breathed again. Antiseptic. Cologne. And the third note, metal. It lived in the back of the throat, a memory more than a smell, a nickel-thin edge on clean air. She tasted it once as a freshman in a fume hood, with Professor Harrison pacing behind her, chalk snapping, the word invisible written large, underlined. She had learned to trust her nose the way divers trust their gauges. She set the bottle down. The room hummed. 10 feet away, a group of men in white coats gathered under a bank of recessed lights, their faces suspended in a perpetual midday. At the center, Dr. Thaddeus Reynolds held a tablet like a tincture. His hair was the kind of silver that looks like a choice. "Gentlemen," he said, and the room obliged him. "Mr. Blackwell's hepatic indices continue to slide. Neurologic function worsen. Sensory loss. Weakness. Fasciculations. We have eliminated infection. Autoimmune panels are inconclusive. Paraneoplastic workup is negative." He shaped the pause like a delicate incision considering more exotic pathways. They formed a half-circle of listening. Angela wiped the mahogany edge of a disguised ventilator and became part of the furniture. She tracked the cadence more than the words certainty, thinned by fatigue. Authority balanced on the need to stay authoritative. "The cleaning staff needs to finish quickly," Reynolds added without turning. It wasn't cruelty. It was climate. Angela nodded to no one. Finish quickly. As if the speed of her hands mattered more than the accuracy of her eyes. She moved to the bathroom with its stone slab vanity and its hotel choreography of grooming artifacts. Every bottle had a serif font and a backstory. The hand cream sat near the sink in a jar black enough to imply a private jet. She had wiped around it yesterday. Today it had been nudged forward toward the edge. Like an actor finding his light, she lifted it. The lid unscrewed with a frictionless sound that reminded her of money. Inside, the cream shone faintly. Note glitter, note mica. A sheen the color of suspicion. She held it under the downlight. The surface reflected a pallor she couldn't file under cosmetic. Inches from the bed, the monitors stitched their green song. She glanced at Blackwell's chart clipped to a stand. Peripheral neuropathy noted in the leg, now ascending. GI distress. Hair loss. The handwriting tilted right the way resident script tilts after 18 hours. She returned the chart to its clip and placed the jar exactly where she'd found it, aligning the label with the counter seam as if a ruler would check her later. She pictured a stairwell, landing 3 floors down, a 19-year-old version of herself holding a notebook, taking notes she could not afford to forget. Scholarship kid, invisible in a different way, visible only as promise. She had loved the lab, the way some people love choirs, the order, the ritual, the music of result. Then a phone call shaped like a car accident. Then 3 young faces and a kitchen that needed money. Leaving school had felt temporary until it calcified into a habit called later. She backed into the main room with the hand cream's ghost still in her lungs. The team had shifted to differential arguments. Someone offered mitochondrial. Someone else suggested a rare storage disease. A younger voice, she would learn later he was Dr. Aaron Park, ventured environmental. Reynolds thanked him in a tone that filed the suggestion into the drawer labeled, "We tried that." The suite door opened silently and presented a man built of tailoring. The badge clipped to his lapel announced, Jefferson Burke. Magazines taught Angela to recognize his face, the rival who smiles in photographs with crossed arms. He walked like a keynote. "Victor's resting," Reynolds said, as if he controlled sleep. "No improvement. I brought his favorite hand cream," Burke replied, producing a twin of the jar Angela had just held, as if conjured from air. He placed it on the nightstand like an offering from Switzerland. "It's the only one he tolerates." The sentence wore cologne. The jar found a position where any hand reaching for the water would touch it. Burke's fingers lingered an unnecessary second on the lid. Staged casual. Angela's mind wrote the action down. She kept her face a map without roads and drifted to the shadow by the window. The glass reflected everyone backwards. Angela saw her own outline, superimposed over a city pretending it had time left for everything. Burke spoke to Reynolds in the dialect of men who negotiate for sport. He asked precise, concerned questions that meant little and did not wait for their answers. He looked at Victor once and performed a well-practiced sorrow. He squeezed the shoulder of a nurse, took care to be seen. Then he left as quickly as he had arrived, as if the air in the room did not deserve his lungs for more than a minute. When the door sighed shut, the scent of his aftershave walked one more circle around the bed and faded. The jar remained, patient. Angela followed the cloth across a side table, collecting dust that didn't dare be visible. She had learned to clean the way she had learned chemistry, patiently, system by system, from the largest surfaces down to edges barely wide enough to name. People think housekeeping is repetitive. They don't see variation. They don't notice what moved between Tuesday and Wednesday. What hand turned a bottle a degree to the left? What coaster sweat pattern suggests a new habit? Observation is a profession. Her profession had simply been renamed. She stepped to the bed and adjusted the sheet with professional care. Victor's hand, emerging from the hospital blanket, looked like a version of a hand that used to sign contracts fast. The nails were dull. The skin had a dryness that lotion would love to touch. If you wanted a delivery system that seemed tender, you would choose exactly this. Ms. Beaumont, the nurse, Sarah, stood in the doorway with a chart and an economy of kindness. "We're going to turn him in a minute. I'll be done," Angela said. The nurse smiled, then glanced at the gathering of white coats. The smile thinned. Hierarchies make facial expressions into code. Angela rolled her cart toward the door. Before it opened, she looked back once more. The nightstand surface held 3 things in a triangle: water carafe, remote, cream, geometry with intent. In the corridor, the fluorescent hum replaced the suite's curated hush. A porter pushed an empty bed like a ship in a narrow canal. From somewhere down the hall came a monitor's alarm, then the soft chorus of feet answering it. Angela checked her watch, a cheap face that kept time better than any Rolex, and returned to her route. She was halfway through the next room before she realized she was holding her breath. She let it out slowly and tasted metal again, as if the scent had followed her through the AC duct. Logic argued, molecule disperse. Its memory, her body didn't care. It had learned to listen to herself long after people stopped doing it for her. In the staff bathroom, she washed her hands longer than the poster recommended and looked up. Mirrors in hospitals are utilitarian, they insist. She met her own eyes and catalogued what they held. Fatigue calibrated to sustainable, a small pulse of fear, a steady band of anger. Under it, something harder than hope, decision, maybe, the knowledge of a pattern fitting into place. They don't see me, she said to the mirror. The sound startled her in the tiled quiet. She lowered her voice. But I see them. I see this. She dried her hands and wiped the edge of the mirror because no one else would, and because it was hers to make true. She pictured the textbook still on a shelf at home, its spine cracked from years ago. The paragraph about thallium highlighted, the note margin in her handwriting. Perfect poison, unless you ask it the right question. Back in the corridor, she passed Reynolds moving the other way, phone to ear. Confidence, doing what it always did with him, lifted his height by an inch. He brushed past her without seeing. The contact was gentle, the message categorical. She waited for the sting and found it didn't land the way it used to. Something in her had repositioned the furniture. At the end of the hall, floor-to-ceiling windows showed the city as a scatter of light across wet streets. Angela stopped long enough to understand how small she was inside the building, and how exact her purpose could be anyway. She gripped the cart handle and turned it toward the service elevator. The wheels answered. When the doors closed around her, stainless steel reflected her into endlessness. Each panel held a slightly different Angela, one with her jaw set, one with her eyes soft, one looking older than 38, one looking like the student a professor once predicted would find edges, others don't. She raised a hand and watched 4 hands rise back. At the basement level, the doors opened to detergent and concrete, and the hiss of washers chewing at the day's linens. She threaded through carts of folded white like glaciers and let the humidity fold around her. Down here, nobody pretended this was a hotel. Down here, the building admitted what it was, a place where bodies are repaired or not. She didn't have a badge that opened labs. She didn't have a credential that made a sentence an order. She had a pattern, a nose, a mind that still ran like a river once you removed the rocks, and a patient upstairs who might not have a week while men debated elegant diseases. The elevator doors closed again and carried her up, past floors of shrugging art and important signage, toward the suite with wood warm enough to make suffering polite. She stepped back into the hush and let it clothe her. The jar waited by the water, the monitors flickered. Faithful, in the air, small as dust, lay the faintest taste of metal. She moved her cart to the corner and picked up her cloth. She wasn't finished. Not with the room, not with the story the room was telling. Invisible people memorize buildings the way sailors memorize currents. By the end of a week, you can feel where a hinge is loose, just by the way a door exhales, tell which elevator hesitates between floors, predict when the automatic lights in a corridor will decide to believe in motion again. By the end of a month, the place is a second skeleton. Your steps articulate it. Its veins carry you. By the time the clock slid toward 4 a.m., Angela could have walked the luxury wing blindfolded. A service stair with a cold rail connected the East Nurses Station to a corridor, where the HVAC coughed at the top of every hour. A side door near radiology skipped its latch if you palmed the plate and pressed with your hip. The hand sanitizer dispenser outside Suite 64 spit a fraction too much, with a 1-second delay that made harried doctors swear under their breath. The building had habits, so did its people. She wheeled her cart down the quiet spine of the floor, past framed abstracts, past flowers that arrived like apologies. At the admin alcove, a clipboard lay in the exact position she knew it would whenever Reynolds pre-rounded. Margin notes penned with a fountain pen ink. The color of wealth, bullet points, arranged to perform mastery. She didn't touch the paper. She slipped a smaller sheet between the top 2 pages so it would surface when the stack lifted. Her handwriting had been trained by lined notebooks and the need to be legible in bad light. Thallium. Consider hair segment analysis 1-2 centimeters. From scalp, targeted ICP-MS blood urine. Transdermal exposure possible. Check personal products. No name, no claim. Just a question written like an order so it would read like a possibility. She moved on, hands steady, heart behaving. When she reached the staff bathroom, she washed her gloves off, washed her hands beneath, then washed the feeling of exposure until the water cooled. The mirror had the indecency to be honest. In it, she saw a woman who looked built for endurance, jaw squared by years, eyes bright despite the hour, hair coiled into labor. The uniform made her smaller. Her posture wouldn't allow it. Hold, she told herself, quiet as a lab instruction. Hold until you can point. At 6 a.m., the wing changed temperature. Day shift voices arrived like starling. Busy and certain, the coffee line at the nurses' station formed. The tray line in the kitchen clattered into choreography. A resident laughed too loudly. Someone made a pun about rounds. A consultancy promised results stat that would arrive at noon. The world put on its daylight face. Angela finished the last room on her slate and pushed into the corridor outside the main conference space, just as the last of Reynolds' team closed the glass door with the satisfied hush of expensive seals. She didn't mean to listen. She meant to clean the fingerprint on the stainless steel push plate, but sound travels through glass the way rumor travels through a small town. It leaks, and apparently, Reynolds said, voice carrying the way authority learns to carry. Our cleaning staff has diagnostic opinions. A ripple. Appreciation for the joke. Gratitude at being allowed to laugh. Someone else, Angela didn't know the voice added. We ran heavy metals day 1. Exactly. Reynolds replied. We'll revisit immunologic serologies. Consider mitochondrial overlap syndromes. Let's not wander into a delicate pause. Detective fiction. The laugh that followed wasn't cruel. It was worse. It was casual. It was a room relieved to keep its shape. Angela's hand tightened on the cart's handle until the plastic bit her palm. It had taken 3 lines to write that note. It had taken 15 years to be the person who could. She stood there long enough for the sharpness to dull into clarity. Then she eased away, let the wheels roll, and did the job the badge said she did. At 10, she clocked out. Sun set the polished floor into a river of reflections. She passed the visitor's desk, where a volunteer folded pamphlets like origami, walked under the atrium's glass, where already there were journalists who didn't yet know a story was waiting nearby, and stepped into the day. Her apartment smelled like laundry and pencil erasers. Tasha was at the table, earbuds in, a graphing calculator under her fingers. Marcus knelt on the carpet with cleats he'd outgrown without telling anyone. Morning light climbed their faces. For a moment, the room was a photograph Angela wanted to keep exactly as it was. "You look like you fought a dragon," Tasha said, plucking an earbud. "Just dust," Angela said, kissing the crown of her daughter's head. "Dust with opinions." "You sleep?" Marcus asked. "Not yet," she said. Soon, she showered the building off her. Antiseptic, a smear of someone else's perfume, the stress salts that gather at the back of the neck. In a closet where cardboard boxes made neat archives of her life, she pulled down a weight labeled "Books" in black marker that had gone soft at the edges. Inside, sleeves of old paper, organic synth binders, notebooks with blue covers. A library. Sale copy of Toxicology, Principles and Practice, with margins, annotated in a hand that looked impossibly hopeful. She spread the book open to the chapter on thallium. Colorless, odorless, tasteless, rapid GI absorption, distribution to soft tissues and hair follicles, interferes with potassium channels, neuropathy ascending, alopecia delayed. Hair segment analysis, historical dosing map, Prussian blue, ferric hexacyanoferrate, binds thallium in the GI tract, interrupts enterohepatic recirculation. She had written these phrases once as if they were lyrics. She mouthed them now like prayer. On the next page, she had scrawled a note to herself back then. "Ask the right question, and the invisible becomes data." She flipped through, finding underlines gone faint, stars in margins announcing moments when the world had revealed a hinge. Her eyes stopped at a phrase she'd circled until the paper bruised. Chronic, low-dose exposure frequently evades standard panels. Angela exhaled. The observation and the answer nested like Russian dolls. She grabbed a legal pad and drew a timeline. Down the left, dates she remembered or could infer from the flow of the wing. Last Tuesday's code event. The rhythm of Burke's appearances, the pattern of symptoms recorded on bedside charts. Across the top, markers, neuropathy, GI, alopecia. She drew lines where lines belonged. Peaks coincided with visits. Dips had their own story. Her pencil made a case. The afternoon pressed at the windows. She ate standing up because sitting would end her day. She took 2 hours of sleep in a fitful block, woke with her heart already deciding, and began to build a bridge between knowledge and influence. Influence would not come through the front door. It would have to slide under it. At the hospital library, a space where quiet is not a courtesy but a policy. She logged into a public terminal, with hands that felt suddenly too large for the keyboard. PubMed blinked awake. She searched Thallium Chronic Exposure Hair Analysis ICP-MS Case Report and read until citations braided themselves into certainty. A 2011 paper en pseudo-Guillain-Barré présentation. A 2016 toxicology bulletin, cautioning against relying on broad, heavy metal panels, a hospital protocol from a teaching center in the Midwest, recommending chain of custody procedures for suspect personal products. She printed what she needed. At the copy counter, she assembled the pages with the economy of a woman budgeting paper clips. On the way out, she stopped by the supply closet and borrowed 2 sterile specimen cups and 3 tamper-evident seals. She signed the checkout sheet with the name of a nurse she knew wouldn't get audited. Then she turned around and signed her own name underneath, small and plain. In case someone decided to be a stickler, it wasn't subterfuge, it was fairness. On her break, she found Dr. Park at a workstation swallowed by charts. He looked up with the expression of a person whose name had been called many times from many directions. "Doctor," she said. He straightened, manners rising to the sound of a respectful noun. "Yes, you don't know me," she said. "I'm Environmental Services. I'm not going to take much of your time. Mr. Blackwell fits thallium. Standard panels miss low chronic. If you order targeted ICP-MS and hair segments, you'll have an answer. I can give you citations if you want." His eyes did a quick math between her and the hallway, and whatever he was already late for. He began, then paused, curiosity shouldering protocol aside 1 inch. "Do you have the citations?" She held out the packet. He took it, thumbed to the highlighted lines, and in that moment she watched a door unlatch in his face. "I can put this in the system," he said carefully. "I can't promise it gets prioritized." "Thank you," she said. "And one more thing. It could be transdermal, something like lotion." His gaze sharpened just a degree. "Who else have you told?" She lied for efficiency. "No one." At 8 p.m., with the wings settling into the smaller voice it used at night, Angela ducked into an empty maintenance closet and inventoried a kit: baking soda for pH adjustment, aluminum foil squares, distilled water pilfered from the ironing cart, pH strips, cotton swabs, nitrile gloves one size too big. Nothing conclusive, everything suggestive. She wasn't going to name an element in here. She was going to compel someone who could dast. She labeled 2 cups with preemptive neatness. Cream sample, Mistern date time in it. And control. She added chain of custody lines because chain of custody begins when someone decides it does. She folded a sheet of foil into a makeshift boat because that's what you did if you couldn't requisition a weigh dish. Then she stood very still and felt the tremor of the plan run through her like a mild current. She thought of the consequences. A supervisor's voice sharpened to a point, a job gone, a paycheck already allocated to rent, groceries, field trips promised and not yet paid for. She pictured each consequence in the light and did not flinch. There are days you survive. There are days you choose. They are not always different days. On her way back to the floor, the head of security angled into her path with a body made of rules. "Ms. Beaumont," he said, tone clipped. "We've had reports you're taking an unusual interest in a patient. Stay within scope. We're all on the same team." "I am in scope," she said, pleasant enough to pass inspection. "I clean where it's dirty." He studied her as if he could scrub her for weapons. Finding none, he nodded and moved on, already scanning for the next violation. The wing's lights dimmed to the color of mercy. She felt the building breathe out. She timed her route to coincide with the moment when day nurses slotted into night, when telemetry techs reset their attention, when the pharmacy tube whooshed a cartridge through the wall with the sigh of a building that eats needs. In that minute, she would be a silhouette in the doorway. In that minute, the jar would be where a careful hand had left it. In that minute, invisibility would be a tool she held by the handle. She paused at the window, overlooking the city, to let the feeling pass through her before it hardened into fear. Baltimore made a map of sodium vapor and wet asphalt below. In the glass, she caught a thin ghost of herself, and the faintest glimmer of Prussian blue, from a memory where it belonged to a slide, in a lecture she never finished. She put both hands on the cart and steered toward Suite 64. Behind her, the building remembered everything. Ahead, it was about to learn something new. By late afternoon, the luxury wing wore its public face, quiet competence, under a lacquer of money. When Jefferson Burke reappeared with a smile calibrated to the room, the badge on his lapel winked as he crossed to the nightstand, with the unhurried grace of a benefactor. In his hand, The black jar rode like a small planet with its own gravity. I brought his favorite, he said, soft enough to seem considerate, loud enough to be heard, from Switzerland. The only thing that doesn't irritate his skin, he set it exactly where a thirsty hand would reach. Triangle, complete water carafe. Remote. Cream. A nurse thanked him with the reflex of an overrun day. Reynolds nodded, eyes already moving on to a differential he could pronounce on television. Burke rested his fingers on the lid. A fraction of a second longer than courtesy requires an actor finding the light. Then he left a tasteful wake of cologne and shoes that didn't creak. The door sighed. The room settled. Angela let the air close around her before she moved. She had her route, her cloth, her mask of indifference. She also had the clock inside her that had begun to speak in imperative. Shift, change, glided into position, chart sign-outs, meds accounted for, the pharmacy tube's soft thump in the wall. In that crease between hands, Angela slid into Suite 64. A silhouette in a doorway. Nobody was watching because everyone was working. She crossed to the bathroom, lifted the jar, and felt its cool smoothness through nitrile. In the maintenance closet, a country of mops and the warm breath of laundry chutes, she set up a bench on the flipped lid of a bucket. She uncapped a sterile specimen cup, scraped a pea-sized dollop with a cotton swab, twisted the lid tight, laid a strip of tamper tape across the seam, and wrote what mattered on the label in neat block letters. Cream, MRN, 5,482. Suite, 64. Date time AWB. Next to it, control distilled. Chain of custody begins when you say it does. She drew 3 small signature lines on the cup with a fine-tip pen. Collector, transfer, receipt empty now, ready later. The way future requires you to trust it. She worked quickly, not sloppily. Foil squares for makeshift weighboats. A squeeze bottle of distilled water rescued from the ironing cart. pH strips. A cheap TDS meter she'd bought herself last year because sometimes you want numbers, even if they're only suggestive. This wouldn't name an element. It would point at one. She dissolved a fleck of cream into a measured volume of water until the mixture went from pearly to translucent plaques. Control cup. Just water. She logged what tiny changes she could. pH drift, not explained by fragrance. Conductivity, above control. A response to simple ion exchangers that told her something was in there besides emollients and marketing. Suggestive is not proof, but suggestive can force proof's door. She photographed every step with her phone angle. Scale, label. Legible. Then sealed the sample in a Ziploc. Like a secret. You plan to confess properly. Outside, the wing thickened into evening. Angela found Sarah at the nurse's station, a pen clenched between 2 fingers. Eyes on an EMR she'd been glaring into for 12 hours. "Can I steal 10 seconds?" Angela asked, not leaning on the counter. Hands visible, stance careful as approaching a skittish animal. "You can have 8, Sarah said without looking up, but the edge in her voice was less polished than earlier. Exhaustion erodes hierarchy. "I need you to collect hair on Miss Blackwell, 1 to 2 centimeters from scalp, near the crown. Secure it with a tamper-evident seal. Send it to Tox, specifically for ICP-MS blood and urine. 2. But hair will give us timeline. Put rule out thallium on the requisition. If you can. Include chronic, low-dose exposure suspected." Sarah's eyes lifted slow, disbelief sliding into irritation. "Angela, We ran metals, broad panels. Angela said, they miss chronic low dose. The presentation is textbook ascending neuropathy, GI distress. Alopecia pattern. Transdermal is plausible. He uses a lot of lotion. You can't order tests. Sarah said, I know. Angela said, you can. Silence had its own alarm tone. The station hummed. From a nearby room, a monitor chirped, then keyed. Sarah's mouth made a stern line. Then her jaw softened a centimeter change. Nothing from far away, everything up close. If I do this, she said, and it's nothing. I'll scrub this wing twice, Angela said, start to finish. Sarah held her gaze long enough to make a contract, then nodded once and stood. Don't talk to anyone, she said. If this ends up stupid, I want it to be my stupid. It won't, Angela said, because she had to. A technician brought the tamper kit. Sarah gloved up, walked into 64, with the ceremony of someone who understands that small acts can be big. Angela didn't follow. She didn't need the war. She needed the win. 10 minutes later, a labeled envelope moved down the hall in Sarah's hand, toward the pneumatic tube with the serenity you get when a process begins to exist. Angela let herself breathe exactly twice, and then went hunting for Dr. Park. She found him in a glass-fronted alcove, where day bled into night, shoulders hunched, eyes doing math on 3 charts at once. I gave nursing a request for hair analysis. Angela said without preamble, please add a targeted order for thallium to the lab Q blood, urine, and hair ICP-MS. Also, a consult to toxicology. If I'm wrong, I owe you coffee for a year. He blinked at the force of her entrance. Then the words sorted. He scrolled, frowned, scrolled again. Heavy metals were broad, she said. He's a billionaire in a room full of lotions. Transdermal isn't exotic. If it's thallium, Prussian blue buys us back time. Park's eyes sharpened, not with defensiveness, but with curiosity given permission. Hair segmenting would give us dosing intervals. He said, halfway to himself. His fingers moved. I can place the orders, whether they get expedited, then make it an urgent rule-out poisoning. Angela said, if you attach a grown-up word, they run faster. Park almost smiled. Grown-up word. Got it. The orders went. The tube sighed. Somewhere in the hospital, a lab bench made space. At 2 p.m., the page went out, emergency conference, suite 64, and the wing's arteries brought authority to the door. They came like weather fronts, hematology, neurology, renal, ICU, each with a vocabulary built from different storms. Reynolds took the center, flanked by a confidence you could count. Angela shouldn't have been there. That's why she was. She entered between a pharmacist and a social worker, a shadow that forgot to be cast. The air in the room pinched around her. Reynolds noticed her as one notices a temperature change. This is a closed medical. He's being poisoned with thallium, Angela said, voice carrying not because it was loud, but because it was a chord struck on a string you can't tune any other way. Presentation is classic. Ascending peripheral neuropathy, G distress, alopecia, with a specific pattern, gum discoloration, transdermal exposure, likely his hand cream. A hair segment analysis will map dosing over the last months. Targeted ICP-MS will confirm. Prussian blue is the antidote. Silence took the room in both hands and held it. Reynolds didn't look at her. He looked at the table where she set down a thin stack of citations with highlights, a timeline of Burke visits against recorded symptom spikes, and a labeled specimen cup sealed with tamper tape. The label was so neat it looked printed. He stared at it as if neatness were a kind of threat. Security, he said mildly. not to a person so much as to the idea of control. Park stepped forward before any uniform could arrive, his tablet already open. I placed targeted orders for thallium, blood, and urine, he said quickly. Sarah sent hair to tox. We can initiate Prussian blue empirically if we accept the risk. A nephrologist cleared his throat. Risk is minimal compared to current trajectory, he murmured. If this is right, we want it yesterday. A neurologist spoke into the stillness. The neuropathy pattern is uncomfortable to ignore. Reynolds' gaze lifted to Angela, as if to ask how exactly gravity was working today. And your name is Angela Beaumont, she said. Environmental Services. Former chemistry scholarship student. Left for family. Didn't leave the work. She kept her voice flat. Because biography is a trap that turns facts into inspiration, and inspiration into dismissal. How did you test it? A toxicology consultant asked, curiosity outweighing decorum. I didn't test for thallium, Angela said carefully. I performed suggestive screens conductivity, pH behavior documented, sealed, preserved. Enough to justify real analysis by your lab. Enough to justify hair segments. I'm not your lab. I'm your alarm. Something like a smile ghosted the toxicologist's mouth. That's the correct answer. Reynolds looked past Angela to the monitors, which had no interest in anyone's ego. Then he looked at Blackwell's face gray, thinner, the lashes a little darker than last week. He didn't sigh. He did something quieter, recalibrated, start Prussian blue, he said to the room, not to her. Stat. Repeat labs in 6 hours. Neurology. Continue current support. Park. Follow tox. Security. Pull all visitor footage for Mr. Blackwell for the last 3 months and send to hospital counsel. Somebody move. Everybody move. The room transformed from debate to procedure in a single command. Angela stepped back into the wall and let the conversion happen around her like a building switching generators. Sarah passed her gloves on, eyes bright the way fear makes them. If you're wrong, she said, not slowing. I won't be. Angela said, not as promise as prognosis. In the glass of the cabinet, she saw herself flanked by white coats, a blue uniform smudged with a day's honest work, and it felt like standing between 2 photographs of the same person taken years apart. She wasn't sure how long she had been holding her breath until she let it go, and felt light-headed with oxygen. The Prussian blue arrived from pharmacy in a bottle, the color of old postcards. Nurses calculated dose with the precision you reserve for things you can't afford to mess up. The first capsule slid down a tube toward a stomach that had been receiving uninvited medals for months. Around the bed, the team arranged hope into tasks. Angela eased to the door. She didn't belong in the center of this room. She had already done the part the center couldn't do. In the hall, she found a patch of neutral wall and leaned the weight of her back against it. Her hands trembled now that they were allowed. Park stopped in front of her, breath audible. If this works, he said, you know what happens. Someone gets better, Angela said. He shook his head. That too, he said. And a lot of people learn how to look. A messenger sprinted by with a printed rush on yellow paper. The word stat looked almost embarrassed at how often it had been used today. Somewhere in the bowels of the hospital, a mass spectrometer sang peaks. Somewhere, a hair sample inched through a chain that documented every palm it crossed. Somewhere, a security analyst pressed play and slowed a frame until a shoulder blocked a lens, and the shape of a hand did what it thought nobody would ever see. Angela closed her eyes and let the hospital's sound map weave into a single pulse. It wasn't peace, it was procedure. Behind her, the door hissed. Inside, a body received an antidote named for a color she could see. when she tilted her head at the memory of a lecture hall. Ahead, a printout would say numbers that made arrogance into evidence. For now, there was only the corridor and its long breath, and the taste of metal finally diluted enough to ignore. She pushed off the wall, adjusted the angle of her cart by an inch, the way you do when you want to remember. You can then walk toward the next thing that needed cleaning. The antidote arrived inside a clear bag, with a typed sticker that managed to sound both practical and mythic: Prussian blue ferric hexacyanoferrate. The capsules looked like maritime beads, tiny reliquaries of pigment. If you cracked one, the stain would live on your fingers for days. It slid down the feeding tube with the anonymous grace of all interventions that matter: nothing beautiful to watch and everything beautiful to measure. The room converted its breath. Alarms that had been poised like sprinters eased back on their toes. Oxygen lines purred. The ventilator took a less greedy share. A nurse counted seconds under her breath the way gamblers count cards, eyes flicking from pressure to pulse, to the gut that would soon begin trapping a metal invisible to the naked kind of seeing. In the reflection of the cabinet, blue winked and vanished. Outside, the hallway carried a new frequency: the crackle of radios, the scrape of shoe leather that does not apologize. Two suits threaded through the wing without looking lost: Agent Ramirez and Agent Martinez, accompanied by the head of hospital security, whose jaw had shifted from administrative to prosecutorial. They moved with the authority of paperwork already signed. "Let's start with visitor logs," Ramirez said, voice trimmed to fit quiet places. "We want the last 90 days and raw security footage for the suite and adjacent hallways." The head of security, a man built like a door, muttered into his radio and watched the corridor as if it might confess. A tech from IT rolled up with a cart that held the future in small boxes. "All feeds are 1080p, 30 frames," she said. "Room entry has a blind wedge near the door frame." Not much, but she shrugged, a professional acknowledging the limits of lenses. "Pull the blind spot angles anyway," Martinez said. "People hide in what they think you can't afford to watch." Inside the suite, Reynolds stood at the foot of the bed as if he'd been stationed there for years. His jaw had learned a new shape today, the kind you get when certainty is made to share the room. "Labs in 6 hours," he murmured. "We mark vitals every 15. He looked older in the soft wood light, not frail human. He turned, finally, toward the edge of the room where a blue uniform had learned to occupy space without charging rent. The apology arrived like a patient who had been triaged and was now stable enough to enter the narrative. "Ms. Beaumont," he said, and the words felt like he had searched for the right salutation. He met her eyes for the first time, as if they were a place, not an obstacle. "Your intervention was a slight cough, not medical correct." Angela nodded. "Not too deep, because bows become habits." "I was loud enough to be heard," she said. "Nothing more." "Loud enough," he repeated, as if cataloging dosage. Down in security, the video lab bloomed on a 12-screen wall. Time lived here as a ribbon. You could pluck at it and hear the past answer. Ramirez pointed. "Start 10 days before first recorded neuropathy. Work forward. Flag every visitor who brings an item." The footage obliged. Bourbons of tailored suits, fist bumps that called themselves care, a parade of flowers that wilted on schedule, and then the man with the smile he wore like a watch, stepping into the blind wedge beside the nightstand. The camera caught his shoulder at the edge. It caught his hand when it moved away. On the table, the black jar's label had rotated 4 degrees. To most eyes, nothing. To people who clean or steal, everything. "Hold," Martinez said. The tech froze the frame. Back 3. Forward 1. Now go half speed. They watched the hand return, fingertips doing something just below sightline. The shape suggested a twist, a shake, a pinch. When it lifted, a micro sheen hung on the jar's rim, a glint that lived for a single frame, and then was memory. Find other instances, Ramirez said. Build a montage. We'll give it to his lawyer as a gift. In the log, the tech added, he addresses a nurse by first name, mentions the brand, like a mantra. Of course he does. Martinez said, predators adore the theater of kindness. By the time the wall clock had eaten 40 minutes, the monitors beside the bed began to write a new poem. Heart rate softened out of its sawtooth. Blood pressure found the middle of the road. A cluster of numbers turned from italic to regular, which is how screens tell you they intend to keep you. The nurse's shoulders dropped half an inch. First, draw in 20, Park said, sliding into the room with a tablet hugged to his chest like contraband. He looked at Angela with the kind of smile you allow yourself when you've gambled your name on someone else's certainty and it looks like you might keep both. If the ICP-MS sings, we'll hear it before supper. Hair segment, Angela asked. In queue, Park said. Rush designation. Tox is clearing bench space. Outside, a pneumatic tube whispered a capsule toward the lab. Inside, a capsule of pigment dissolved the past into something the body could expel. Actions found their counteractions. The world leaned towards solvable. The toxicology lab on sublevel 2 smelled like solvents and second chances. An analyst with a knuckle tattoo of a tiny wrench prepped the inductively coupled plasma mass spec with the tenderness people reserve for machines they trust more than people. Plasma ignited. The instrument purred like a large, patient cat. Is that our billionaire? He asked his colleague. It's our patient, she replied, voice even. We don't assign net worth to ions. They ran controls. They ran blanks. Then they ran Mr. Blackwell. The screen mapped peaks across axes, like a seismograph, reading the Earth's smallest earthquake. There, she said, tapping the unmistakable spike with a capped pen. Thallium. Units, enough to make a point, and to make a case. She printed the report because rituals matter, signed the bottom because chain of custody is a romance between ink and procedure, and walked it up herself, because this is one of those times you don't trust interoffice mail. At the nurse's station, Sarah took the paper like a letter from a war and walked fast. Inside the room, Reynolds was speaking softly to a patient who hovered near the surface like a diver deciding whether to come up. Angela stayed back as the report changed hands. The medical lexicon did what it does best, translating the unspeakable into steps. We continue Prussian blue, Reynolds said. Monitor electrolytes. Avoid chelators that worsen thallium redistribution. Adjust analgesia. Notify pharmacy for standing orders. Document all personal effects for forensic review. A hospital lawyer arrived, a woman with hair too practical for television, and spoke with security about evidence locks. We'll treat the jar as a felony object, she said. Chain of custody from here is sacred. Anyone touches it, sign. No one touches it who doesn't need to. Pull the sister jar from the trash. 2. Angela said before she could stop herself. He brought a twin earlier. It might carry residue from whatever he used to spike. The lawyer turned, eyebrows not unkind. You're on the witness list, she said. Start making peace with that. Agents Ramirez and Martinez met with Angela in a small consult room whose art on the wall had been chosen to offend no one. They did not offer the patronizing warmth of people who think they're talking to a mascot. They offered professional curiosity, which is better. Walk us through what you observed. Ramirez said. From the first sensory anomaly forward, Angela did. She kept it clean, no flourishes, no digressions, only sequence and sense. The smell, the nails, the jar, the position shifts, the timing, the test she had not run, the samples she had preserved, the nudge she had given a process to become itself. When she finished, Martinez nodded like a carpenter, admiring a well-laid line. "What's your background again?" he asked. "Because a good report repeats facts. It already knows to see if they change." "Chemistry," she said, interrupted. "I kept learning anyway. People underestimate the distance between school and knowledge," he said. "You just narrowed it for a lot of us." "Will he be arraigned here?" she asked. "In a way," Ramirez said, mouth crooked. "He'll be arraigned wherever cameras are." 3 hours after the first dose, Blackwell's numbers wrote their first true plateau. The ventilator eased. As if grateful, he stirred. Nurses fussed with the blameless efficiency of women who have seen everything and carry it without breaking. Reynolds stayed close, posture less erect, as if he had finally sat down inside himself. Angela drifted to the doorway. You can learn a lot about a person by watching the moments when credit could be stolen. She saw the breath leave Reynolds's chest before he spoke. "Mr. Blackwell," he said when the man's eyes opened to a narrow brightness, voice clean of performance. "You were being poisoned. We missed it. We're correcting that now. This is Angela Beaumont." She saw what we didn't. Blackwell's gaze found her like a boat finding a light. He didn't deliver a speech. He formed a whisper that carried more oxygen than any mask. "Thank you." The words reached her and rearranged nothing fundamental. She had not done this for thanks, but they did a small, important thing to the part of her that had rehearsed indifference for years. Behind her, in the hallway, a burst of applause rose and died before anyone could call it unprofessional. It wasn't for a miracle. It was for a course correction. Security collected the jar in a clear evidence box, dignified by labels. Cameras recorded the chain of hands. In a conference room, counsel drafted statements that were designed to say much and reveal little. Grave. Journalists were already blooming in the lobby like invasive flowers. Park brought Angela a chair. The gesture was small. It branded the hour in her memory more than the lab spike had. People with chairs offering one to someone who usually stands. This is how hierarchy learns. "You should sit," he said. "You've been on your feet for 20 hours. She sat. The chair held. "How did you see it?" Reynolds asked later, not as a challenge but as a man who collects techniques. "I'm invisible," she said simply. "You'd be amazed what lines connect when nobody draws you into their picture. And I never stopped doing the work just without the framing." He nodded like a student who has been forced into humility by a better answer than he expected. Evening arrived with the exhausted gold of late-day sun. The lab sent its second confirmation. The hair segment analysis began to sketch dosage like growth rings. The security montage played on a hospital laptop that had never been asked to carry this kind of story. Somewhere, a judge signed a warrant while the defense outlined a narrative about old friends and misunderstood creams. Angela stood at the window and watched the city receive the hour. In the glass, she saw the room behind her in fragments. Blue capsules, white coats, a man inside a bed he didn't choose, and her own face, unadorned, neither triumphant nor small, just present. For the first time in days, the metallic taste lifted. It didn't leave because justice had arrived. Justice travels by bus. It left because a body upstairs was fighting with better tools than disbelief. She pushed off the glass and collected her cart. The way you pick up your instrument after the soloist finishes. Work remained. It always does. She moved into the corridor, where the air now smelled like cleaner and relief. Behind her, the suite hummed at a new pitch. Ahead, the building kept its secrets and its systems, both altered by the color that had entered the day and refused to leave. Blue, she thought, and the word meant antidote, evidence, sky after a storm, and the ink you use when you sign your name to a thing that will not forget you. By noon, the hospital had learned a new trick: how to say thank you without loosening its tie. An email went system-wide, with a subject that sounded like a policy and not a feeling, acknowledgement of exemplary conduct, and a paragraph that managed to praise without admitting liability. In the wing, a laminated memo appeared on a corkboard near the ice machine. It used phrases like collaborative environment and cross-functional excellence, and did not say her name until the fourth line, as if the institution needed to clear its throat first. A pager message summoned her to administration. The hallway to the executive suite was carpeted in a muffling blue that made footfalls behave. The receptionist wore diplomacy for lipstick and pointed her into a conference room where the windows were so clean they turned the city into a diagram. Dr. Eleanor Matthews arrived with a folder and the posture of someone calibrating tone. "Ms. Beaumont," she said with a careful smile, "you've placed this institution in an unusual position." Angela watched the smile the way a lab tech watches a meniscus. She said nothing. "You demonstrated in a non-clinical capacity insight that contributed to a life-saving intervention." Matthews continued, "The board wishes to recognize your initiative." She set the folder down so precisely the paper could have aligned itself. "The hospital is authorizing paid administrative leave while you assist security and law enforcement. We will also be reviewing a pathway for additional education, should you be interested, to formalize your remarkable aptitude. Paid." The word footprinted rent, groceries. The precise elevation of Tasha's eyebrows when talk turned to field trip fees. Leave. The word sounded like a trap door built of compliments. "I appreciate that," Angela said. Her voice had not changed shape all day. It remained a tool, and Matthews exhaled a preposition to ensure patient privacy and institutional integrity. "We'll ask that you refrain from media engagement. Our communications team will provide language," an attorney at the end of the table added, "for your protection as much as ours." Angela nodded. Protection always had two faces. She signed a form that promised to keep her accurate and quiet, and a second that promised the hospital would keep her paid and temporarily gone. On the elevator down, she stood next to a gift basket that tasted like apologies, ribbons, cellophane, cheeses with names that did not admit to cows. Someone had written, "Thank you for your service" on the card, and forgotten to fill in the line underneath. Security did its part for theater. Jefferson Burke came through a service corridor in handcuffs, flanked by men whose suits could hold their own in any boardroom. The cuffs weren't necessary. This wasn't a flight risk play, so much as a narrative correction. The corridor, which had learned to feed gurneys and sorrow quietly, watched passively. Angela was there because the corridor happens to be where her cart was parked. Burke's eyes moved across the world like an auditor's, assigning columns to faces. They slid over her, either because he still hadn't learned to see her, or because he finally had and preferred not to. The cameras did what cameras do. A lens blinked. Somewhere, a newsroom woke. "Ma'am," one of the officers said as they passed. "Sir," she replied, Because civility costs less than rage. The elevator swallowed the trio. The doors kissed shut. By evening, the hospital lobby flowered with microphones on sticks and people who pronounced Baltimore as if it were a guessing game. Security funneled them into pens with nylon belts. A PR officer read 3 lines about partnership with authorities and commitment to patient safety, and then retreated, leaving the reporters to interview each other. The air smelled like coffee burned past apology. Angela took a side exit and walked into a late-day sun that gilded even bad architecture. The bus stop shelter held a woman asleep in her coat, a man rewrapping his hand with a dirty bandage, a teenager watching something in headphones that made his face bright. On the corner, a fruit stand stacked apples into a geometry that had learned not to collapse. Home was 3 flights up, a door with a lock that stuck. If you were in a hurry, a living room that had long ago learned to multitask. Marcus was on the floor with a soccer ball tucked under his knee like a pet. Tasha at the table with 2 notebooks open and a rubber band holding back her hair like a promise. "You look tired," Marcus announced, which is how boys say, "I worried until you got here." "I'll sleep when I graduate," Angela said, and the words left her mouth before she realized they were a map. Tasha looked up teenage detective, acquiring facts by osmosis. "They finally said your name in their emails," she said. "Bianca's mom texted me a screenshot. Did she spell it right?" Angela asked. "She capitalized it," Tasha said. "It looked heavy. They ate pasta that admitted to being from a jar. The television stayed off because news is a rude dinner guest." After dishes, Angela spread the folder from administration on the table next to Tasha's physics sheet and Marcus's spelling list. The paper had a weight that could tilt a life. "Paid leave," she said, tapping one page. "For a little while, and they may help with school, if I want that." "Obviously you want that," Tasha said, not looking up. "You talk about molecules in your sleep." Marcus squinted at the paper. "Do you have to leave us?" "Never," Angela said. She let the word sit, and then, like all honest people, edited it. "Not leave. Reroute. I'd be here more oddly than now. Classes in the morning, the lab in the afternoon, nights, not cleaning them." They all sat with the shape the future was trying on. Marcus traced a finger along the edge of the folder. Tasha watched her mother the way a scientist watches a reaction when she has a theory and a fire extinguisher. "What do you want?" Tasha asked. Angela looked at the ceiling, as if a truth had been taped there. "To use the thing I didn't unlearn," she said, "without asking permission to be allowed in the room I've been working in from the hallway for years." "Do it," Tasha said flat, like an order. "We'll figure the rest." Marcus nodded. "I can walk home after practice. Coach doesn't hate me anymore." Angela laughed, a sound that carried relief and fear like twins. "Coach never hated you," she said. "He just didn't like your back heels." "They're sick," Marcus said, affronted. "They are," Angela agreed. "Solemn." When they were asleep, she sat in the quiet and opened another box from the closet bills in crisp stacks. Notes she'd written to herself over the years on the backs of grocery lists. "Ask better questions. Don't let them talk you into silence. Chain of custody begins with you." She laid those notes on top of the hospital's forms like a palimpsest, history showing through new ink. Her phone buzzed with an unknown number. For a second, she considered the odds: press, con, cousin, and then she answered, "Miss Beaumont, this is Victor Blackwell." His voice, through the small speaker, sounded like a man who had been to the edge of his own body and returned with a passport stamp. She stood, because some conversations require spine. "I wanted to thank you properly," he said. "In person, ideally. If you'd indulge me tomorrow, She looked at the magnets on the fridge, holding up school forms and coupons. At the sink with one bowl left in it because someone had abandoned cereal mid-spoon. At the window that did not close perfectly on cold nights. "Yes," she said, "tomorrow's fine. Bring no one," he said, almost joking. Some men make humor perform trust because that's what they've taught it to do. "My office, noon." She hung up, wrote noon on the back of her hand because she trusted her body more than her phone, and tried to sleep. The night did what nights do. When a decision is waiting, they put all your thoughts on a turntable and spin them until you feel a little sick. The lobby of Blackwell Innovations looked like a museum where the only installation was money. The receptionist's desk was a study in minimalism. The glass elevator made everyone honest about the shape of their fear. She rode up through floors of men who nodded in a way that said they were used to nods being returned. On the top floor, she walked across carpet that disguised itself as cloud, and let the assistant usher her into a room that had views for walls. Victor sat behind a desk that acknowledged wood existed without fully committing to the substance. He stood when she entered. That alone altered the weather. "Ms. Beaumont," he said, offering a hand that had machines to thank. "Please sit." She sat the way people sit when they are sure the chair is not for them. He noticed, adjusted nothing, and placed a folder on the desk between them, identical in color to the one from the hospital, but with edges that telegraphed speed. "I am alive because you refuse to be the quietest person in the room," he said. "I have nothing of equal value to offer. I do have resources. I'm creating a fund, interruption to continuum, for people whose intelligence took a detour. You are its first recipient, full tuition, living stipend, administrative leverage to put you in a lab as a paid intern while you study, and, if you want it, a position the minute you finish." The words arranged themselves into a future her muscles didn't trust yet. "This isn't charity?" she asked, and he smiled in a way that briefly made him look like a smart boy who'd been forgiven. "It's investment," he said, "in you, and in all the Angelas who were told to mop around the problem." He slid the folder forward. Papers with seals, contracts with lines for signatures, a card with a name of a person whose only job was to say yes to logistics. "I have children," she said, because logistics lived in her house like a second rent. "Covered," he said. "Stipend offsets childcare. Hours flex to your life. This is designed by a woman with 2 kids who runs my foundation and has better ideas than I do." Angela placed her palm on the folder as if testing the temperature of a bath. "You did your research," she said. "I have teams," he said, then softened. "But I also have a debt. Debts have shapes. This one looked like a bridge being built from both sides at once." She did not say yes. She did not say later. She said, "I need to talk to my family." "Of course," he said. "People who make choices alone are either saints or fools." He stood as she stood. The handshake this time was a small ceremony. As she rode down the glass throat of the building, the city arranged itself in squares. She could see the hospital in the distance, a ship of light. She pressed the folder to her chest like contraband, and let herself smile where no one could use it against her. That night, they decided around a table that had hosted birthdays, fevers, and arguments about bedtime. Tasha read the stipend numbers like a lawyer. Marcus asked if it meant they could still have Friday pizzas. It did. It might even mean the kind from the place with basil that actually tastes like basil. "Then it's settled," Tasha said, pushing the folder back to her mother with ceremony. "You go finish the thing you started, and we'll handle everything." "Not that." "Everything not that," Marcus echoed, committing to a job he would only later understand. Angela signed where names become promises. The pen felt heavier than it should, like it had more ink than physics allowed. When she finished, she looked at the line where her name sloped, and did not feel like an invitation she might be rescinded from. She felt like a person whose signature finally knew what it was for. Later, when the apartment had quieted into the good kind of residential noise, piping sighs, neighbor footsteps, like muffled punctuation, she pulled the old uniform from the back of the closet. She laid it on the bed and smoothed the fabric. It looked smaller than it used to, not physically, but in the way certain clothes shrink when you realize they were never meant to be your size. She folded it carefully and put it back, not as relic and not as warning, but as evidence. The first thing she had ever worn that made her invisible enough to see. The badge printer spit out her new name in laminate and lanyard. Angela Baumont. Student toxicology intern. The letters looked real in a way the last decade had refused to be. She clipped it on and walked through the main entrance without feeling like she was trespassing. Security nodded with the professional indifference she had once worn like a cloak. Today, indifference felt like a corridor opening. Up in the lab, morning smelled like solvents and hot plastic. The benches stood in tidy ranks, under lamps that made glassware gleam. A technician with a buzz cut and a tattoo of a tiny wrench across his knuckle handed her a logbook the way priests hand out hymns. "Start of day," he said. "Instrument checks. ICP-MS warm-up. We sign every deviation like it owes us rent." Angela ran a fingertip down the calibration checklist and felt something inside her click into an old gear. Tuning solution. On. Nebulizer. Clean. Torch ignition. Stable. Background counts. Within control limits. She slid into the choreography of QAQC like a dancer who hadn't forgotten the steps, blanks, low standards, mid-range, high, plotting a calibration curve that rose obediently along the line of best fit, peaks sharpened. The thallium window sang in a quiet key only the machine and a few people cared to hear. "You work fast," the tech said, watching her confirm R²0. 9×9. "I read the manual," she said, "which in certain rooms still counts as flirtation. You're going to ruin our reputation for being necessary," he said, not unhappily, and left her to the hum. Her afternoons were measured in controls and chain of custody seals, in accession numbers printed on labels that would outlive every conversation she had today. She learned the lab's rituals, the double witness on felony objects, the tone you used when calling floors for redraws, the way you documented when a sample arrived sweating on ice. Because time changes state like anything else. Not everyone adjusted to the new geography. In a corridor outside path, a surgeon, in a coat, starched to the tensile strength of pride, looked at her badge and at her face as if they were different people. "Facilities is down a floor," he said, smiling lightly with the ingrained ease of men who mistake their charm for courtesy. "Chemistry is this floor," she said, stepping past him with the kind of small, precise smile that refuses to be a fight. On day 3, a case arrived that smelled like farm dirt and panic. Male, late 30s, acute cholinergic symptoms, salivation, bronchospasm, meiosis, pesticide exposure. Suspected AG. Serum cholinesterase came back low. The ED wanted confirmation. Also, the patient wasn't improving as expected. The team's urgency crackled down the requisition like static. Angela pulled the sample under the fume hood and began the derivatization for GCMS. While the ICP's plasma idled, the first run suggested organophosphate. But the metabolite profile was wrong for the formulation. The family brought in a crumpled jug. On the second pass, she widened the search windows and found an oxon metabolite that suggested illegal decanting. The pesticide in the mislabeled container was a stronger cousin. The antidote dose the ED had ordered had been calibrated to the label, not the content. She carried the printout to the phone. "This is tox," she said when the ED answered. "You're treating for the wrong formulation. He needs double the atropine," the physician on the other end said, brittle with relief and dread. "And pralidoxime sooner than you wanted," she said. "He doesn't have an hour to debate." They didn't debate. They pushed meds, and the numbers on the ED monitors did the small miracle of obeying chemistry. She signed the report and slid it into records with a satisfaction that was not pride so much as alignment. Hypothesis, method, result, breath. Words seeped faster than any memo. In minutes and then hours, faces around the hospital recalibrated. Some turned toward her with the surprised respect of people who discover a window where they thought there was a wall. Others tightened their smiles, as if the room had shrunk. She carried neither reaction home. That's a trick you learn when you've had to survive being seen and unseen in the same day. Between runs, Park would lean into the doorframe with an extra coffee and a question about an obscure metabolite, a tone that contained neither flattery nor utility, just collegial curiosity. "You've started a black market in diligence," he told her once, and she laughed in spite of herself. Reynolds remained an adult in a city of children. In the elevator one morning, he studied the panel and found the floor he needed, then found the sentence he owed. "You should have been here 10 years ago," he said, not looking at her, which made it easier to believe him. When the doors opened, he offered a small nod. It was a quiet amendment to an earlier document. She countersigned with a nod of her own. Classroom hours came like tide. Angela sat under fluorescents, with students who knew the price of tuition and the shape of ambition. Spectroscopy lectures ran like music. She took notes with a discipline that startled the professor into a smile. In Advanced Analytical Lab, she built a method from scratch to separate two ions that pretended to be cousins, isobaric interference, and wrote the discussion as if drafting policy for a country that was tired of mistakes. At home, the apartment learned a new schedule. She cooked in batches on Sunday, labeled containers with Bolognese 312 and stir-fry 314, like a tiny supply chain manager. Tasha taped a calendar to the fridge and wrote, "Mom, midterm, Marcus game with different colors." Marcus learned to knot his cleats himself and started saying, "I've got it," in a voice that understood what it was taking from her and giving back. Nights that belonged to exhaustion also belonged to study. The kitchen table held lives like layers, ion chromatography problem sets, alongside a permission slip for the zoo trip, a half-read case law article on expert testimony under Daubert, next to a grocery list that started with milk and ended with sleep. She set timers and wrote until the words stopped performing and began doing their jobs. News from downtown traveled by way of people who loved gossip more than they loved accuracy. Burke appeared in arraignment video stills, wearing a suit that tried to look modest. The footage from the hospital angles edited into montage made its way into the file like an accusation, and into the evening news like narrative. His attorneys filed motions that used words like inadmissible and contaminated chain. The lab produced signatures and timestamps. Until the motions looked tired, she didn't watch the hearings. She had ion suppression to troubleshoot and a detector drift to tame. At odd hours, she would see headlines on flat screens in hallways. His name, the word alleged, a photo of the evidence box, with the black jar preserved like a relic, and keep walking. Justice worried her less than precision. Justice is a team sport. Precision is a pact with your own hands. Not everything bent to the better. In the break room, she overheard a pair of residents rehearsing confidence by belittling what they did not understand. "It's cute," one said, "the way admin thinks they can PR their way into equity. It's cheaper than raises," the other replied. She refilled the coffee urn without joining and without leaving. Let their words annotate her day without becoming its thesis. People don't dismantle pyramids in a week. They chip at the stone. They build ramps. They learn to carry in a quiet hour. The lab took a consult from occupational health, a cluster of maintenance workers with numbness, mood changes, headaches. The initial panels were unrevealing. Angela asked for a map of their workflow and noticed all lines converged on a storage room where paint thinners lived in drums that dated back to administrations ago. She swabbed the air intake and found solvent concentrations high enough to make OSHA call them by their first names. The building sealed a vent. Epidemiology logged a win. And someone in facilities sent a tray of cookies with a thank you note that spelled Bowman. She pinned the note to the corkboard above her desk and wrote a small T over the M with a ballpoint. It wasn't pettiness. It was a data correction. On a Thursday, she opened a drawer in the lab and found a laminated flowchart titled Evidence Handling Personal Products. Someone had written adopted and a date and initialed TR in the corner. The boxes described steps she had once performed with tape and nerve: collect, seal, log, avoid field tests that destroy sample, notify counsel. It read like a system learning to remember. That evening, she walked past a bank of windows and saw her reflection wearing a white coat. The lab manager had insisted she take when she started consulting on methods. It didn't fit like a costume. It fit like a tool. She stood there long enough to be embarrassed by the sentiment, and then went back to work. In the late-night quiet of the apartment, after both kids surrendered to sleep, and the building settled into the susurrus of pipes and footsteps, she pulled the old uniform from the closet and laid it across a chair. The fabric had softened from washes and years. She touched the sleeve where disinfectant had bleached the blue to a shy gray. Not a relic, a control, proof that two truths could occupy one body: invisible and necessary, overlooked and irreplaceable. Her phone buzzed. Park. A photo of a line on a chart with the caption, "Your curve is prettier than mine." She typed back, "That's because mine got more sleep." Then added JK, "because you never know when humor will need training wheel." Sleep came late and light. Before it did, she stared at the ceiling and made a list. Tomorrow, calibration, midterm review, Marcus pickup, call Blackwell Foundation, contact stipend schedule, send email to Dr. Singh about ion suppression in Matrix X, remind Tasha, science fair list. She numbered nothing. Each item had its own gravity. The next morning, the building greeted her with the scent of disinfectant and burnt toast. A transporter she recognized from the night shift intercepted her near the elevators, eyes bright with a quiet conspiracy. "I started classes," the woman said. "Nights. LPN track." "Good." Angela said, "Let the building think you're a shadow. Use it." "I will," she said. "And thanks for the way you do doors." Angela smiled in the private way people do when they see a version of themselves stepping out of the mirror and into a hallway. Back in the lab, she checked the calibration drift and signed the morning line with a pen that worked. A fresh rack of samples weighted the hospital's daily vocabulary in barcodes and caps. She slid the first tube into the carousel and listened to the machine gather flame, the plasma lit with a soft, assertive roar. Peaks rose, fell, aligned. The world, unruly and riddled with men who think jars are harmless, still answered to spectra. Her phone chimed with a calendar reminder, Blackwell Foundation kickoff. Boardroom level. She glanced at the clock, saved her run, and stripped off her gloves. Outside the lab door, the corridor led toward a glass elevator and a room with views for walls. She straightened the lanyard, smoothed the coat, and stepped into the long return she had chosen. One measured in stairwells and spectra, policy memos and permission granted too late, but not too little. The doors opened. She didn't check her reflection. The building already knew who she was. The elevator opened into a floor curated to make money feel like restraint. Gallery white walls, low conversation, coffee that tasted like a thesis defense. A discreet placard announced, "The Blackwell Foundation, Interruption to Continuum, Launch and Award." Beyond glass, the city looked like an etched map pressed against the windows. Angela stood at the threshold and took in the room's engineered calm. Round tables dressed in linen, centerpieces that were really equations, steel arcs, single stems, a pebble balanced wrong side up. At the far end, a lectern waited with a logo that had learned how to be humble. Ms. Beaumont, an assistant asked, appearing with ecosystem efficiency, "We'll seat you here, near the front." She guided Angela toward a table where a placard read, "Recipients," in the kind of font that thinks of itself as a good listener. Other recipients arrived, carrying biographies in their shoulders, a delivery driver with a linguistics paper folded into a jacket pocket, a landscaper who smelled faintly of rain, a retail clerk with a notebook like a second heartbeat. They sat with a carefulness that didn't belong to chairs. Names were exchanged. Stories were sketched. Confidence tried its suit on. Lights softened. A string quartet stopped pretending to be furniture. Victor Blackwell took the stage minus the pallor from the hospital weeks, his voice warmed by an introduction that said only what it had to. He paused long enough to let silence lay out a runway. "Intelligence," he began, "is not a credential. It is a current. Systems build dams. Sometimes the water finds another way." He gestured toward the recipient's table without theatrics. "When a system fails you, it is not a referendum on your capacity. It is a report on the system." The line landed. People at tables looked at their hands. People on the dais looked at the donors. Victor continued, "The Interruption to Continuum Fund exists for those whose paths were forced off the map. Tonight, we start by acknowledging 5 such paths. Tomorrow, we go looking for the ones that would never stand in a room like this unless we changed the room." Polite applause turned into real sound. Dr. Eleanor Matthews took a measured seat at the end of the stage, performing collegiality with a competence that almost made it true. Dr. Reynolds sat 3 rows back, posture trimmed of ornament. His eyes never left the lectern, as if learning a language by watching a mouth. Angela's name arrived as a bell rung with intention. She rose in a dress borrowed from a neighbor and walked the aisle that had been built between the tables, skin aware of every camera. At the steps, Victor met her with an authenticity that had survived committee. He didn't pose. He shook her hand like a man who had stopped measuring. To building doors that weren't there, he said, quiet enough to belong to only them. And seeing the ones that were, she returned. Flashbulbs were behaved. The plaque was understated. The stipend numbers lived in sealed envelopes that would open to change the shape of months. She turned to the room and let it hold her for 3 beats, not to be swallowed by it, but to make a memory she could spend later when a hallway got small. After she found a patch of shadow by an exit sign and allowed herself to breathe. The walls hummed with donor talk metrics, outreach, optics. Park drifted over with a grin that reached his eyes. "They're going to put your name on a brochure," he said. "Just make sure they spell it the way I do," she said. "You realize this is going to make some people behave better," he said, nodding toward a cluster of suits, "and make other people behave worse. Both are diagnoses," she said. "Treat accordingly." On quay, Reynolds approached, carrying a paper cup, as if a higher-end vessel would be excessive, and stopped with the awkwardness of a man writing a sentence in a new tense. "Congratulations," he said, then glanced down, either at the coffee he didn't want or the humility he hadn't practiced. "Also thank you for forcing better practice. Thank you for letting it change you," she said. He accepted the line like a prescription and moved on. Matthews arrived by Vector, shook Angela's hand with institutional grace, and said, "We're formalizing a cross-disciplinary observational protocol. Your input would be valuable. I'll bring a mop and a flowchart." Angela said. Matthews almost smiled. "Just the flowchart." The speeches ended before they could become a chorus. Donors escaped their chairs. Recipients were angled toward cameras like constellations. Angela slipped through a service door into a stairwell that smelled faintly of paint and new budgets. She sat 2 steps down, above a landing window, where the city cut a rectangle through the wall, and took a minute from a day that was trying to spend her. A voice at the top of the stairs made her look up. It was the transporter from the hospital. Scrub top replaced by a dress, hair pulled back with an elastic that had decided to be brave. "I came," she said, a little breathless, as if getting permission had been its own climb. "I wanted to see if rooms like this make me allergic. Only if you breathe through your mouth," Angela said, sliding over to make space. "How's school?" "I passed my first med-calc quiz," she said, pride arriving shy and then staying. "I keep hearing your voice when I study. Use the shadow angles live there. And prism. Keep going," Angela said. "The building responds to persistence like it's medicine." They sat until the voices inside sank an octave. The transporter squared her shoulders and returned to her life with a freshly sharpened edge. On another floor, another kind of ceremony was underway. In a conference room whose blinds were drawn against dignity, agents Ramirez and Martinez watched a screen divide itself into hours. The montage they'd requested had matured, an edit that made intent cheap enough to purchase. Burke's shoulders slipped into a camera's blind wedge and blocked the view. His hand moved like information undercover. Over weeks, visits lined up with lab spikes, with nurses' notes about increased discomfort, with card swipe logs that placed him in the room during minutes that later mattered. "Jamie," Martinez said to the IT analyst, "overlay the email timeline." Colored bars slid under the footage. Dates adhered to faces. A message surfaced on the secondary monitor. "He's slipping. Stay the course. J. B." Ramirez didn't seek. He made a neat note. "Subpoena the Swiss intermediary," he said. "The shell invoices read like theater. I want the stage." Jamie clicked through ledger screens. The shell's invoices described cosmetic research, additive trace, a description both cowardly and accurate. Routing numbers looped through a jurisdiction that makes secrecy a service industry. Martinez circled a date. "And that," he said, tapping, "is the day the hand cream batch got a premium variant." "Ego leaves fingerprints," Ramirez said. "Arrogance leaves diaries," Jamie corrected. Zooming in on the micro-sheen at the jar's lip, a single frame where physics betrayed concealment. Elsewhere, A grand jury learned new words, including Prussian blue, and found them compelling enough to sound like anger. Burke's counsel issued a statement about misunderstanding and malevolence, with sentences so symmetrical they felt machine-made. The hospital absorbed the launch party like rain. A printed sign went up outside the lab. Evidence handling personal products. Adopted. Initials tight in a corner TR. The flowchart read like cinnamon to people who had been cold. Collect. Seal. Log. Preserve. Notify counsel. Staff began to say chain of custody without flinching. A nurse who had been quiet in meetings now asked the questions that adjust outcomes. The cafeteria coffee did not improve. Some things require revolutions, not reforms. Across town, a panel at the law school convened to discuss credential bias in clinical contexts. Angela declined the invitation and sent her hours to a case where a child's lead levels refused to map to the apartment's paint. She followed the mother across sidewalks, watched where the boy put his hands, saw a municipal drinking fountain at a park with a galvanized pipe older than anyone's memory. The lab confirmed. Public Works sent a crew with clipboards and new pipe, and for once, a fix looked like a fix. At week's end, Angela stood with Park at a window outside the Foundation's boardroom, watching the city practice evening. Inside, donors debated, reach with voices calibrated not to threaten dessert. Park handed her a paper cup. "They're naming a scholarship after you," he said. "Beaumont, 1W. I checked. Tell them to name it after my kid's shoes," she said. He leaned on the glass with the ease of someone who had learned to calibrate weight. "You know he's going to plead," Park said, meaning Burke. "Arrogance only works up to arraignment. He'll call it a misunderstanding until the ink dries," she said. "Self-destruction comes disguised as strategy." "Do you ever get tired," he asked, "of being right before everyone else?" "Yes," she said, "but the silence before and after is less noisy now." He smiled, then turned serious. "Reynolds asked me to sit on a new protocol committee observation rounds that include EVS, transport, dietary, maintenance, cross-functional pattern checks. He wants you there. I'll bring a mop and a flow chart," she said again. And this time Park laughed openly. As they turned to go, Angela paused. Through the glass, she could see her reflection layered with the room beyond donors' hands. A logo, a future wrapped in polite language, her face superimposed over the city's noise. Visibility felt like a light you borrow, not one you own. She didn't mind. The work didn't depend on it. On her walk back to the lab, a volunteer from the front desk intercepted her with a printed card edged with a blue border. Beaumont Scholarship. Notice of endowment. She traced the letters with a thumb as if they might misbehave. Names are data. Data wants to be correct. Outside. Weather recalibrated the kind of sky that tells you the next hour doesn't owe the last one an explanation. A boy on a scooter shot past trailing laughter. A street musician bent a note into something you could carry. Angela took the stairs instead of the elevator because the building felt easier when she made it earn every floor. At the landing, a custodian she knew from nights paused, with a loaded bin, nodded at her badge, and said, "Good to see you up here." "You too," she said, and meant the you, not the here. Back in the lab, the evening run weighted capsules lined like a string of small decisions. She washed her hands, gloved, checked the drift, initialed the line, and fed the machine its meal. The plasma lit, a contained aurora. Peaks rose and found their places, like people being introduced properly for the first time. On her bench, a note card leaned against a beaker. "Remember, ask the right question." V. She flipped it over. Someone had sketched a tiny door with a hinge on the wrong side. She smiled, slid the card into a drawer with the flowchart, and turned back to the screen where Spectra wrote a language she had always understood. Outside, the boardroom weather shifted from applause to planning. Inside, ions told the truth. She trusted the second to bend the first. Eventually, at the end of her shift, she walked past the window that, at this hour, gave the city back to itself. In the glass, she saw a woman in a white coat with a badge that earned her the right to ignore it. She adjusted her lanyard by an inch, the way you do when you remember the edges that got you here. Then she kept moving down the corridor, through the door, into the night that doesn't care who you are, only what you do next. It started with glass clean, decisive, everywhere. Morning rain had salted the street, and the shards in the driver's seat caught the light like a field of small knives. Her car looked like it had been taught a lesson. On the front seat, a hand-sized stone river smooth, chosen for how well it fits between anger and aim. Nunati, people who think they're giving warnings trust, silence to do the lettering. Angela stood on the curb and tasted the air. No metal, just wet concrete, and the coppery twinge that arrives when your body decides to prepare for pain. She reached in through a sleeve, cleared a space with a tote bag, and sat. Tiny triangles of safety glass stuck to her coat and made their own constellation. She brushed them away with the gesture of someone brushing a shoulder after a stranger's hand. "Bad luck," the parking attendant said from a polite distance. "Bad aim," she replied, because humor sometimes holds the artery shut. She vacuumed the worst of it with a shop vac the size of a toddler, taped a trash bag over the window, the way field surgeons tape skin, and drove to work through the crinkle and flutter of provisional solutions. On the first bump, the plastic thrummed. On the next, it sang. She adjusted the radio louder and refused the soundtrack. By the time she reached the lab, rain had dried to a film. She checked calibration, signed her initials in the box, where initials now lived, and fed the instrument its breakfast. Peaks rose, the plasma soothed. She held the pipette too tight for the first 5 minutes, then less. Then normally, when the run finished, she washed her hands twice and didn't look at her nails. The second break came in paper. Back home, exhausted and unbraced, she pulled toxicology, principles and practice from the shelf to show Tasha how hair keeps time. The spine, softened by years and heat, and the unfancy humidity of their apartment, cracked with a sound that didn't belong to cardboard. The pages shucked loose, a sheaf sliding onto the table with the defeated grace of a card trick gone wrong. Tasha recoiled and then reached. "We can tape it," she said, already scanning for repair. "Leave it," Angela said, gentler than she felt. She ran a palm over the page that had once been an index door into a room she couldn't afford. Notes in her own younger hand clawed through the margins. "Ask the right question. Perfect poison until you say its name." Her chest tightened. Grief, or the beginning of a laugh. "It did its job," she added. "The book moved. I can let the binding break." That night, the city answered with sirens and a neighbor arguing with a boyfriend and a radiator banging like a stagehand missing his cue. She slept in pieces and woke early to make a list she couldn't complete. Replace window. Borrow a book. Keep moving. Courtrooms are theaters that paid their electric bill. The wood is heavy, the ceiling always a little higher than human. She took a back bench because her coat still shed microscopic glitter from the car, and she didn't want a bailiff to decide. She looked like trouble. The TV pool camera on a tripod blinked red, polite and predatory. The defendant's table shone. Burke wore gray as if gray were a strategy. His tie had a texture that suggested subliminal messaging. His lawyers arranged binders into barricades and performed empathy with their eyebrows. He adjusted a cuff, lifted a chin. When he looked toward the gallery, his gaze slid past her like oil on a pan. The prosecution called security. They called the toxicologist with the R-squared face. They called the IT analyst who made video do tricks it had been too lazy to try. On the screen, the montage played, shoulder slipping into the camera's blind wedge, hand moving with stage direction. The jar turned 4 degrees, and that 4 degrees told a story about intent that no amount of philanthropy could buy back. A juror shifted in his seat at the line. He's slipping. Stay the course. Someone coughed. The judge glanced over his glasses in a way that said, I am a human pretending to be a wall. Do not test me. The defense tried to teach Dowd a dance. Chain of custody. They said, stroking the words like a cat. Contamination. Heavy metals in urban environments. Stress-induced alopecia. They made the room short of breath on purpose. Then the toxicologist opened the hair segment analysis like a fan, bands of time, each 3 weeks, each singing the same unwelcome note, louder when the black jar visited, softer when it didn't. Science drew a map nobody wanted to be from. When he explained Prussian blue in a sentence, a juror could take home and repeat to a neighbor. Even the defense pencils paused. Burke did not explode. That's not how certain men go. He eroded along the edges. First, the jawline. Certainty, then the blink rate, finally the set of his shoulders. By afternoon, his smile looked like a costume he'd forgotten to return. Angela didn't stay for the argument about bail. She had an instrument to calibrate, and a son to fetch, and a window to tape again. In the hallway, a local anchor rehearsed a sign-off, where she would say the words alleged poisoning and billionaire within one breath and feel the nouns click. Angela took the stairs. The third break refused metaphor. A letter waited in the mailbox in an envelope that had learned to sweat. We regret to inform. You pressed its face against the plastic window. She carried it upstairs without opening it, laid it on the table, and stood with her hands flat like a paramedic assessing pulse through paper. Tasha read upside down the way teenagers read secrets. Scholarship, she asked. Stipend disbursement delay, Angela said after she finally tore the seal. Administrative review. It'll hit next week. She pictured the budget like a patient with a slow bleed stable, then not, then stabilized again with a trick called pasta. Okay, Tasha said. Too quickly. We have noodles, and my babysitting money, and we can, Angela said, and we will. This is a hiccup, not a hemorrhage. Marcus kicked off one cleat, with a violence that belonged to the field. I don't need new boots, he announced preemptively. She looked at his heel, blister-ringed. Brave. You will, she said, but not this week. Tape buys time. They ate pasta that pretended to be festive. She laughed at something Marcus said because laughter is a fluid that keeps joints moving. After dishes, she answered a polite email from Blackwell Foundation, accounting with a gratitude that didn't perform, just documented. She sent a second email to her landlord, attaching screenshots and apology, and a date. She pressed send and felt the small clunk of a decision that would not impress anyone but mattered anyway. Work did what work does when life shakes it. Held. In occupational health, a cluster of maintenance workers continued to improve after the vent closure. One came by with a box of cookies and a shy thank you, and mispronounced her name in a way that made it new and good. In the lab, an unexpected matrix effect tried to corrupt the results on a batch of blood drawn after exposure to a solvent she could smell 10 feet away. She adjusted the method, and wrote a note for the next tech, so knowledge could build instead of start over. On the floor, a nurse, Angela didn't know a month ago, asked if she'd sit in on a family meeting as translator of plain language. She explained spectra without saying spectrum, explained risk without saying lawyer, explained patience without lying. The family left with their shoulders lower, which is not medicine but adjacent. The upstairs world misbehaved. A news site ran a story with her photo and 3 facts, shaped to perform a better paragraph. Single mother, gifted dropout, custodian turned intern. The comments did what they're paid to do. She didn't read them past the first line. Park texted a screenshot of the byline and wrote, "They spelled it right." She replied, "Tell them to spell stipend right next." He sent a laughing emoji and a calendar invite to a committee meeting. One afternoon, as the hospital spun a theater axis, she met Reynolds in the corridor by the vending machines, where good intentions go to die. He bought a bottle of water like a man who had decided to hydrate his humility. "He'll plead," he said vaguely, meaning the defendant. "He's letting his lawyers put bandages on a fracture that needs a cast." "Ego heals crooked," she said, punching B7 for a bag of pretzels like a person casting a vote. He glanced down at her hands, at the tiny glass glitter still lodged in a cuticle despite the 100 hand washings since morning. "You okay?" he asked, tone earnestly clumsy. She looked at her fingers, at a world full of edges. "Things break," she said. "It doesn't mean they were wrong." He nodded. "Slow. We're writing your observational protocol into orientation," he said, almost proud. "Every new resident will be forced to listen." "Force with snacks," she said. "They learn better when their blood sugar behaves." He smiled. "The kind you only get when your pride has taken a swim and come back better." The fourth break arrived in a voice the head of security phoned while she measured standards. "We reviewed footage from the garage," he said. "We can't identify the person who hit your car. Angle's wrong. Timing is awkward. We'll keep checking." "Thank you," she said. "You didn't deserve it," he added, and the word deserve landed like a pebble in a pond of bigger nouns. She hung up and watched the calibration points plot along a line that didn't care who deserved what. R 的平方零 999, truth cooperating. She initialed the run and realized her hand had stopped shaking without asking permission. On her break, she walked down to the lot with a roll of proper plastic and a length of real tape. The clouds had broken in the theatrical way cities sell postcards. She pulled the trash bag off, cleaned the frame, fitted the new sheet with method. A kid on a scooter wheeled past and stopped to watch, chin on handlebar. "You fixing your car?" he asked. "Just teaching it patience," she said. "Cool," he said, which meant okay, and pushed off into speed. Back upstairs, a post-it waited on her bench in Park's handwriting. "Hair segments back for case 62 Peaks match visits." She flipped the report and read the bands like tree rings. Time speaking in growth. Poison mapped to minutes. She thought of her broken book and felt a particular relief. Some texts you never have to open again because their contents now live inside you. Evenings tasted different. The apartment was the same radiator, hallway footsteps, TV bleed from a neighbor who favored procedurals, but somewhere a pitch had shifted. Tasha's science fair project grew algae in jars, lined up like choir members. Marcus's taped heel blistered and healed and blistered again, and then didn't. The landlord replied, "Thanks for the heads up," with ordinary mercy. The foundation transferred the stipend 2 days early the following week, as if to apologize in currency. One night, after the kids fell asleep in the poses of people trusting tomorrow, Angela pulled the old uniform from the closet and set it beside the broken-spined book. The cloth had thinned to tenderness. She laid her palm over both objects, the way a person might bless a room without meaning to. Then she wrapped the book in brown paper and packed it away. Not thrown out. Archived. You don't toss a ladder because you reached the roof. Her phone buzzed at the edge of midnight. A number she didn't recognize turned out to be a mother from occupational health whose son's headaches had vanished after the vent closure. "We brought cookies," the voice said. Embarrassed it had woken her. "They said you already left." I wanted to say, "I didn't know an air duct could be a villain. Thank you for fighting it." "I didn't fight it," Angela said, sitting up, smiling into the dark. I pointed, "And then people who swing hammers did the rest." She hung up and looked at the ceiling's hairline cracks. Not everything breaks because it's weak. Sometimes it breaks because it's making space for a better shape. Dawn found her at the window with coffee that knew its job. The street was wet again, the trash bag over the driver's window, tight as a drum, ready to sing along to every pothole. She pictured the courtroom at 9, the threadbare dignity of the defendant's tie, the lawyers fitting the word misunderstood onto a mannequin and pretending it looked like a person. She pictured the lab, the instrument, the curve. She pictured her own hands steady in vinyl. When she turned from the glass, she caught her reflection, two Angelus layers, one in the white coat, one in the blue uniform she kept like a passport. Both looked back without flinching. She exhaled, the kind of breath that clears a visor, and picked up her bag. Outside, the day arrived with the sound of small repairs. A street crew hammered a patch into last winter's wound. A woman swept her stoop with ceremonial vigor. Somewhere, a window slammed, a door opened. A bird decided this wire would do. Angela locked the apartment and walked down the stairs toward a car that still worked and a lab that still told the truth. Things break, she thought, and the phrase didn't ache. It simply described a world that, as long as there were hands and light and the right questions, could be put back together. Not as it was, but as it should have been all along. The courthouse hallway had the temperament of a beehive. Polished, humming, everyone pretending the honey was inevitable. Angela stood with her hand on a cool marble column and counted her own breaths like a tech checks baselines. She had learned to arrive early, to let the room find her before it needed her. Across the hall, cameras peered through glass like curious gulls. A clerk rolled a cart of exhibits, evidence boxes, labeled like small, obedient coffins. "Ms. Beaumont," the ADA said, appearing with a folder and a tone tempered by a dozen late nights. "You're still good to testify." "I'm still me," Angela said. He nodded, as if that were legally relevant. "We'll keep it clean. Chain, observation. The lab can sing the arias." Inside, wood and seal and flag. Burke sat at counsel table with the cultivated slack of a man told by expensive people that his face is a strategy. No cuffs, just a belt of rules. When he turned slightly, she saw the exhaustion creep beneath the foundation of his confidence, a silt that had found the corners of his eyes. The state called her mid-morning. She walked to the witness box through air that wanted to be a lens. The bailiff held out a Bible. She chose the other option. Truth is not a book. It's a temperature, spelling of name, occupation, not the one on the tax forms. The one the last months had given back to her hands. "Environmental services technician," she said. "Toxicology intern." The defense attorney's eyebrow lifted at the hyphen life. "Tell us what you observed," the ADA said. "Not what you felt, not what you believe." A narrow door. Angela described the room like a photographer might angles. Light. Placement. She drew the triangle on the nightstand with her palm in the air. Carafe. Remote. Black jar. She spoke about nails and gums, hair, gait, about a smell that lived behind antiseptic, like a coin in a mouth. She said thallium once, clinically, and let the word land without flourish. The ADA took her through the chain, the sterile cup, the seal, the label with the small, neat handwriting that had been training for this in notebooks. Nobody graded. The room listened like a student who finally believes a class might be for them. Defense rose with a smile practiced for mirrors. Miss Beaumont, you're not a doctor. No. You are not a licensed chemist. No. You ran a test in a closet. I preserved a sample, she said evenly. I did not test for thallium. I documented the need for those who could. He worked the angles protocol. Scope, audacity. You understand that your actions were outside hospital policy. They are hospital policy now, she said, not looking at Reynolds, who sat a few rows behind her with a jaw that had learned to accept amending documents. A juror smiled before he remembered not to. The defense pivoted to ambition, and after this, you received opportunities. He made the word sound infectious. I received the chance to finish what I started, she said, and to label bottles correctly. He tried to goad. She refused to be goaded. He tried patronage. She changed languages. When he finally sat, the ADA let the silence breathe for a beat and then asked a question simple enough to carry out of the building. Why did you do it? Because someone was dying, she said, and because the room told me the answer and I refused to ignore it. On the lunch recess, she stood by a window overlooking slate-colored water and watched gulls perform arrogance as an ideology. The ADA joined her with a bottle of water and a schedule. We may not get to the verdict, he said. There are rumblings. Plea. Arrogance learns arithmetic, he said. Eventually, he was wrong about the timing. It didn't take eventually. By 12 o'clock, Burke's counsel asked for a recess, with the measured panic of people trying to pour water back into a glass. After an hour in a conference room that absorbed shouting like carpet absorbs rain, the defendant returned with the thin smile of a man pretending to choose his own sentence. He pled attempted murder, tampering, conspiracy, each count a rung. He was forced to touch on his way down. The courtroom did what rooms do when narrative arrives. Exhale. Victim impact would come later. Sentencing later still. This, for now, was the hinge. Out on the steps, microphones multiplied like mushrooms. Angela waited by a side door with a security guard who had taught a dozen reporters the perimeter last month. You want the long way? He asked. I want the way without adjectives, she said. They threaded through service corridors smelling faintly of plywood and winter. She stepped out into a slant of afternoon, thin as paper, sleet, stung like fine sand. Her phone buzzed with texts. Park's good. Sarah's proud. Tasha's string of emojis that arranged themselves into a dictionary. She typed back home soon and made it true. Sentencing took weeks. A slow math that refused drama. Burke's allocution was a legal origami apology, folded so tightly it forgot to open. The judge's words were sharper than her robe. You mistook proximity for entitlement. You mistook care for cover. He gave years the way surgeons cut precisely, irreversibly. The city rehearsed reacts. Angela did not attend. The work had already taught her everything this moment could. The cost found her elsewhere. Her supervisor called with the voice of someone remembering he also had a job. We're formalizing your transition, he said. Your EVS position is being backfilled permanently. It wasn't cruelty. It was structure catching up to motion. Still, the word landed with the force of a door closing in an old hallway. She imagined the cart's wheels clicking a route she could walk blindfolded. She pictured the night's hush that had made her mind feel big. She confirmed her last day and then sat a while in the lab with the lights off, listening to the ICP's cooling fans, slow like a body turning to sleep. On that last night, she changed into scrubs one final time and pushed a cart down the corridor. Because endings deserve choreography. Sarah found her in the glow outside a patient's door. "You're ridiculous," the nurse said, affection pretending to be scold. "I've been called worse," Angela said. They did a lap together, neither saying the part that hurt. At the elevator, the night staff gathered with a cake that had too much blue frosting and the correct spelling. The head of security handed her a lanyard clip painted Prussian blue and said, "This is not official." The wrench-knuckle tech hugged her with an awkwardness that suggested a calibration mistake. Reynolds arrived late, stood like an apology in a tie, and said, softly, "When I am mentioned at the end of my career, I hope the sentence continues with someone like you." "I hope the sentence continues," she said. She left the cart by the closet door and palmed the handle like a last instrument. The building breathed. She told it goodbye without making a ceremony of it, because some rooms prefer understatement. School accelerated. Papers came back with praise notes that felt like small, clean receipts. Her spectroscopy final sent a rare, bright thrill through her body. When the last problem fell into a line of best fit, the lab put her name second on a methods note about matrix suppression in a solvent nobody pays to headline. She printed the preprint and taped it inside the cabinet where she kept her lunch. Park told her she'd mangled a sentence in her draft. She mended it and didn't mind. The foundation invited her to sit on a selection panel for the next cohort. She said yes, and spent a Sunday reading essays that smelled like bus schedules and burnt coffee, and the stubbornness of people refusing to be erased. She fought for a former home health aide with a paragraph that cut like glass. "This one knows how to watch," she told the committee. The vote went her way. It didn't feel like charity. It felt like expanding the data set. At home, Tasha's algae jars greened into a fair project that won second, and a conversation with a judge who used the word scalability in a way that made them both laugh. Marcus's heel stopped blistering, his back heel pass, no longer forbidden, bent into a perfect assist on a cold Saturday that taught him joy can arrive wrapped in windburn. The car got a real window. The book stayed wrapped in brown paper on a shelf she could reach but didn't. The uniform in the closet stopped smelling like bleach and began smelling like a story. The call came on a Tuesday when the lab's rhythm was calm enough to hear a pencil drop. Unknown number. She answered in the cadence she'd practiced into her marrow. "This is Beaumont." A woman spoke, voice trained to balance authority and shame. "We're at Mercy East. We have an ICU patient with neuropathy and alopecia. We're chasing autoimmune. We're chasing ghosts." A nurse who used to work with Sarah said we should ask you what question we're not asking. Angela put the pipette down like a delicate animal. She stood and looked out the lab window at a city pretending it could keep all of its promises. "Check personal products," she said. "Hair segment analysis 1 to 2 centimeters from scalp. Targeted ICP-MS for thallium and a handful of friends. Start Prussian blue if your pharmacist doesn't blanch at speed. And open your windows. Sometimes the air knows before the chart does." Silence. Then an intake of breath. The sound of a door not quite visible until you walk through it. "Thank you," the woman said. If this is it. It started looking like something else. Angela said, "Don't let that distract you." She hung up and stood very still. In the glass, she saw her outline layered over the bench timer. Rack. A note she'd left herself about a control that liked to misbehave on humid days. She thought of the building across town, straining to grow a hinge in the right place. She thought of all the rooms she would never be in that needed someone who could smell a coin in the mouth of a lie. Park leaned on the door jamb with the practiced casualness of a friend. "You just changed someone's Tuesday," he said. "I'm trying to get good at Thursdays," she said. He handed her a printed agenda. "Observation rounds committee meets at 4. Reynolds wants to open each session with a case where we almost missed it. Start with me," she said. "We didn't almost." They smiled in the small, tired way people do when they know a win is not an ending. Near dusk, she stood at the hospital's mezzanine windows and watched the city alter its spectrum, sodium lamps igniting like incantations, clouds scissoring open to show a rash of clean blue, where the day hadn't used it all. Down below, an ambulance exhaled. Up here, the glass held back a draft nobody wanted to admit to in budget meetings. Angela rested her forehead against the pane and tasted the air with that old habit that had taught her not to ignore small things. No metal, rain in the seam, paper somewhere warmed by a copier, the faint chemical truth of disinfectant, a cafeteria baking a tray of brownies at the wrong hour for diets and the right hour for humility. Her phone chimed with a message from Tasha. "What's for dinner?" and a photo of Marcus doing homework with his feet on the wall like a pair of commas. She typed, "Whatever we can name," and hit send. On the way out, she detoured to the stairwell where, weeks ago, a transporter had paused in borrowed clothes and said she didn't want to be allergic to rooms like this. The landing window was dirty again, pollen, a thumbprint, the city's breath. She pulled a square of cloth from her pocket habit and wiped a circle clear. The glass squeaked a small, stubborn song. The circle became a door. Down the corridor, a machine beeped in a rhythm that meant hurry but not panic. She turned toward it without urgency, because panic is a poor solvent, and pushed into the evening that had no opinion about justice, only lights and roads and cold. She didn't think of the trial, or the broken book, or the cake with the blue frosting that stained everyone's lips like a team. She thought of a simple sentence: ask the right question. Some days that meant science. Some days, signing a form. Some days, telling a child that dinner would be late but true. She reached the exit, glass sliding open with the soft authority of a room admitting what it is. Outside, the air hit her face like an answer. She stepped through. Behind her, the doors closed. In front of her, somewhere on another floor, in another building, someone was about to smell metal and decide they could name it. The city rearranged its noise into a frequency she could walk by. The hinge had turned. The door would keep being found,